What if history is not a straight line, but a shoreline, constantly reshaped by tides we no longer remember? Most of us were taught a comforting story about the past. It begins with small steps and slow awakenings. Stone tools, fire, agriculture, cities. Knowledge accumulates politely. Progress behaves. Civilization advances on schedule. It is a story that reassures us that the present is the natural result of everything that came before. But history, when examined closely, rarely behaves so neatly. Across deserts and oceans, beneath ice sheets and city streets, fragments of another story persist. They appear not as declarations, but as questions. Footprints where they should not exist. Cities where no cities were supposed to be. Tools fashioned with care in eras we were told belonged only to survival. Each discovery, taken alone, seems like an anomaly, an error to be corrected, a puzzle to be filed away. Taken together, they form something more unsettling, a pattern of forgotten complexity. This series is not about overthrowing science or replacing one certainty with another. It is about listening more carefully to the quiet spaces where certainty falters. It is about understanding how knowledge is shaped, not only by evidence, but by expectation, by institutions, by the human need for coherence. In the 20th century, teams of researchers set out on expeditions with ordinary goals. They were sent to confirm timelines, to map terrain, to refine existing theories. What they found instead often unsettled the foundations of those theories. Their discoveries did not arrive with thunder. They arrived slowly, measured in sediment layers, sonar lines, pollen grains, and carved stone. Sometimes the evidence suggested that humans were present far earlier than expected. Sometimes it hinted at societies capable of planning, engineering, and adapting on a scale we did not associate with their time. Sometimes it suggested that climates, landscapes, and possibilities had shifted far more dramatically and far more recently than we were prepared to accept. And often, after the initial reports, something else happened. Funding was withdrawn, data was classified, sites were sealed for protection, careers quietly ended. The story moved on without incorporating the disturbance. The shoreline smoothed itself again. This is not a tale of villains and heroes. Most scientists involved were thoughtful, cautious people working within systems larger than themselves. Science, after all, is a human endeavor. It depends on peer review, consensus, and continuity. These are strengths, but they can also become limitations when new information threatens to unravel the structure that holds everything together. What happens when evidence does not fit the map? Throughout this journey, we will visit 10 such moments, expeditions that uncovered details difficult to reconcile with the official timelines of human history. We will not treat them as final answers. Instead, we will treat them as mirrors, reflecting how knowledge is negotiated and how uncertainty is managed. Each chapter begins with a place, a riverbed, an ice core, a buried city, a stretch of open sea. From there, we will move outward, into the people who made the discoveries, the questions those discoveries raised, and the silences that followed. This is a story about curiosity and constraint, about the tension between what we find and what we are ready to understand, about how easily the past can become fixed, and how fragile that fixation truly is. At its heart, this is not a story about ancient civilizations or lost technologies. It is a story about us, about how modern societies decide what counts as truth, what counts as noise, and what is quietly set aside because it arrives too early, or too late, or simply out of sequence. If the past is stranger than we imagine, it may be because we have learned to look at it through narrow windows. Tonight, we widen the frame, and we begin with something simple, pressed into stone, a human step, frozen in time, asking a question no one was prepared to answer. It began beside a river in Texas, where drought had exposed the bedrock like pages in a book too long closed. In the late 1930s, Dr. Roland Byrd, a paleontologist with the American Museum of Natural History, was dispatched to investigate stories of strange footprints along the Paluxy River. Locals spoke of tracks not just from dinosaurs, but from something far more unsettling: bare human feet, imprinted in the same limestone, seemingly walking beside three-toed reptilian giants. Byrd arrived skeptical. The scientific world had little tolerance for myth dressed as evidence. The age of dinosaurs and the age of humans, we were told, were separated by tens of millions of years. But the tracks were there. Dozens of them. Human-shaped, anatomically precise, striding across the same ancient layer of rock as the dinosaur prints. The impressions bore weight, pressure points, and depth consistent with a living, walking creature. Some showed arches, heels, even toes. Some weaved between dinosaur tracks as if avoiding them. Byrd documented over 100 such prints. He measured them, he photographed them. He even tried to remove several slabs for museum display. The limestone, undisturbed and uniform, told a story that contradicted everything paleontology had built its foundations on. But as Byrd prepared to share his findings, a wall of resistance emerged. The prints, he was told, could not be human, not because of what they showed, but because of what they implied. Human presence in the Cretaceous period, over 100 million years ago, was simply not possible within accepted evolutionary timelines. Therefore, the prints must be misidentified. The American Museum rejected Byrd's attempt to display the tracks. Official explanations shifted. The tracks were erosion artifacts, misinterpreted dinosaur prints, or outright hoaxes. And yet other scientists who examined the site supported Byrd's findings, until they too faced isolation. Careers were stalled. Papers went unpublished. One academic lost tenure after speaking too loudly in defense of the evidence. Eventually, the clearest tracks were destroyed, vandalized, erased from the site. But Byrd had preserved some as plaster casts. Even these began to disappear from museum archives, fading like relics from a dream people wish to forget. Today, the Paluxy site remains. Tourists visit the dinosaur tracks, but the human prints are largely ignored, dismissed, or labeled as curiosities best left unexplored. This is not a tale about disproving evolution or rewriting every timeline. It is about what happens when something does not fit, and the quiet machinery that removes it from sight. It is about the human need for order, even at the expense of curiosity. What if Byrd had been allowed to publish without repercussion? What if the prints had been studied without prejudice? Could we have entertained the possibility, however faint, that the story of life on Earth is more entangled, more overlapping than our neat diagrams suggest? History is not just what is remembered, it is what we allow ourselves to remember. And somewhere beneath the silt of time, those footprints remain, silent, persistent, shaped like ours, waiting to be seen again, not as anomalies, but as invitations to reimagine the terrain of the past. Far below the waves of the Mediterranean Sea, in places no sunlight reaches, lie the outlines of forgotten cities, grids of geometry etched into the ocean floor. Between 1955 and 1968, a team from Columbia University's Marine Geology program embarked on what was meant to be a routine sonar mapping project. Led by Dr. Bruce Heen, the team set out to chart underwater topography, tracing the ancient coastlines that had once hugged the Mediterranean basin. Their aim was geological, not archaeological. They expected to find sediment shifts and submerged cliffs, natural histories written in stone. What they found instead were structures, not just one or two, entire networks. The sonar readings revealed angular formations, perfect right angles, parallel corridors, enclosed plazas. Long roads radiated outward from what looked like central hubs, connecting distant points like spokes in a wheel. These were not the scatterings of erosion. They were planned, intentional, urban. Further analysis painted an even stranger picture. The structures were aligned with astronomical precision, some mimicking the layout of constellations, others oriented to solstice points. Harbors with breakwaters, buildings in regular blocks, drainage systems, even what appeared to be fortifications, walls that followed ridgelines and curves as if designed with military foresight. Ferri's ruins lay at depths suggesting they had been built when sea levels were 400 feet lower, during the last ice age, long before humans were supposed to have developed agriculture, let alone city planning. According to accepted timelines, these designs should not exist. There should have been no people capable of building them. And yet, there they were. When Heen's team prepared to publish their findings, the response was swift and silent. Archaeological institutions dismissed the data. Peer-reviewed journals declined to review the material. The National Science Foundation, which had funded the research, withdrew support. The sonar tapes were sealed. The discoveries were reclassified as geological anomalies. Later surveys of the area were redirected away from the sites. The charts were revised to erase the outlines. Those who tried to revisit the locations were denied permits. Some were warned that their careers could be jeopardized by pursuing speculative archaeology. Others found themselves blocked from access to research vessels or high-resolution imaging equipment. The underwater cities were buried again, not beneath sediment, but beneath bureaucracy. It's possible, of course, that the formations are natural. The ocean can shape stone in strange and symmetrical ways. But the scale, the alignment, the repeating patterns, they whisper of something else. A memory that predates memory. What if civilization didn't begin with a spark, but with a tide? What if cities rose, fell, and were swallowed long before the earliest temples we've found on land? Our maps show us what remains, not what once was. And sometimes what remains is not stone, but silence. Deep beneath the Mediterranean, in stillness that has lasted 10,000 years, those structures wait. Not to tell us what happened, but to remind us that the past we study is shaped as much by what we choose to forget as by what we find. The coldest place on Earth once cradled warmth, lush, green, impossibly alive. In 1980, an international team of scientists gathered in Antarctica for a landmark research expedition. Their mission, to drill deep into the polar ice sheet and extract a continuous core that could reveal the planet's climate history. For Dr. Elena Petrov and her Soviet colleagues, this was a chance to look back hundreds of thousands of years, layer by frozen layer, into the story of Earth itself. What they expected were tales of frost and storm. What they found was something altogether different. At a depth corresponding to around 400,000 years ago, when the continent should have been locked in deep glacial freeze, Petrov's team pulled up fragments of a vanished world. Palm fronds, fern leaves, flowering plants. Not fossils in rock, but organic material, soft, pliable, intact. These were not the leftovers of drifting debris. They were the remnants of an ecosystem, tropical, vibrant, thriving in what should have been a desolate sheet of ice. There were more clues: pollen samples, insect remains, microscopic signs of soil life. Everything pointed to a time when Antarctica supported a temperate climate capable of sustaining life usually found near the equator. Botanical analysis confirmed the species. Carbon dating matched the ice layers. Geological testing ruled out contamination or relocation. The evidence was clear. This lush world had lived and died right where it was found. The implications were staggering. If tropical plants had once grown in Antarctica, then something was deeply wrong or deeply incomplete in our understanding of Earth's climate history. Was the planet's axial tilt different? Had the continents moved faster than geologists believed? Were their cycles of warming and cooling more dramatic than current models could explain? But before the questions could find daylight, the answers were buried. Petrov's findings were immediately classified by the Soviet Academy of Sciences. The tropical samples were relocated to secure facilities. NASA researchers involved in the joint mission were instructed to omit all mention of the biological evidence in their reports. At conferences, the layers were referenced, but their contents were never discussed. Publicly, the drilling site was declared environmentally sensitive and closed to further research. Privately, the message was clear: do not disturb the narrative. Modern climatology, already facing political and institutional pressures, could not afford anomalies that might cast doubt on its core assumptions. So the tropical Antarctica discovery was excised from the timeline. Yet the ice remains, and buried within it, undisturbed, untouched, are chapters of Earth's memory we have yet to read. This is not about denial of science, it is about the courage to expand it. What if the planet's past is more volatile, more alive than we ever imagined? What if we have mistaken stability for truth and built our models on the silence of missing data? Antarctica keeps its secrets well. It preserves without bias, remembers without agenda. And somewhere beneath miles of ancient ice lies a forest, whispering to us of worlds we have not yet dared to believe. The ocean has always been a barrier and a bridge. In 1970, it became a time machine. Thor Heyerdahl, already known for his bold Kon-Tiki voyage across the Pacific, launched a second, more daring expedition. This time, he set his course across the Atlantic, not with modern sails, but aboard a vessel crafted with techniques borrowed from ancient Egypt. The boat was called Ra-2, made of papyrus reeds, bound with rope and sealed with tradition. Skeptics called it a stunt. But Heyerdahl had a theory that ancient civilizations were far more connected than history allowed, that trade routes, migrations, and cultural exchanges had spanned oceans long before Columbus ever dreamed of a compass. He believed the ocean did not isolate early peoples, it connected them. Ra-2 defied doubt. Carried by wind and current, Heyerdahl's crew made landfall in the Caribbean, proving that trans-oceanic travel using ancient technology was not only possible, it was practical. But it wasn't the crossing that made headlines among the scientific community. It was what they discovered along the way. Barnacles clinging to the hull carried genetic markers from multiple continents, indicating that marine species had been traveling and crossbreeding across vast distances for thousands of years, long before modern ships. The ocean, it seemed, remembered more than we did. More curious still were the structures they encountered on remote islands: stone markers, carvings, and navigation aids precisely aligned to stars. Some had been described by indigenous communities as ancient way stations, long abandoned but once maintained. The team documented what looked like lighthouses without light, raised platforms, signal fires, and celestial markers spaced strategically for visibility across the open sea. Artifacts found on these islands, tools, ceramics, inscriptions, suggested cultures had met here, traded, and moved on. Warehouses of goods, ship repair yards, observation towers, maritime outposts from a world we thought had not yet discovered the water. The implications were vast. If prehistoric civilizations had maritime networks, if they charted currents, mapped stars, and maintained waypoints, then our entire notion of cultural isolation crumbled. But when Heyerdahl attempted to share this evidence with academic institutions, he was met with silence, then pushback. His findings were dismissed as misinterpretations, his observations labeled speculative. Funding vanished. Journals declined. His navigational markers were reclassified as natural rock formations. Access to the island sites was soon restricted. Culturally sensitive zones, they were called, no longer open to inquiry. Oceanographers were instructed to steer their studies away from these areas. Maritime archaeology programs were discouraged from exploring supposed prehistoric trade routes. It was easier to label them impossible than to ask the questions they raised. Still, the sea does not lie. It carries memory in currents and coral, in genetic drift and stone. If ancient sailors once crossed oceans with only the stars to guide them, what else did they know that we have forgotten? And more poignantly, what happens to knowledge when it arrives too early for belief? The raw expeditions were never just about proving travel possible. They were about recovering the lost threads of human connection, threads once woven across waters, now hidden beneath tides of doubt. Some truths come ashore in silence, carried not by storms, but by persistence. And on forgotten shores, stones still stand, pointing to stars no longer watched, in languages no longer read, by travelers no longer named. The Sahara was not always a desert. Beneath the dunes, dry, golden, and seemingly eternal, lie the bones of cities. Between 1975 and 1982, a joint French-Algerian archaeological mission led by Henri Lot set out to study ancient rock art in the central Sahara. What they discovered instead would challenge everything we thought we knew about civilization's origins in Africa. Using ground-penetrating radar, Lotta's team detected vast anomalies beneath the sand, regular shapes, buried patterns, voids where no voids should be. They began to excavate, and the sand gave way to stone. Not rough cairns or scattered huts, but city blocks. Laid out before them were the ruins of a metropolis, stone buildings with foundations still intact, paved streets running in grids, drainage systems, multi-level dwellings, and public plazas large enough to gather thousands. The masonry revealed earthquake-resistant design. Some structures were aligned with the stars, entire districts built according to celestial calculations. It was urban planning on a scale and sophistication far beyond anything expected from 8000 BCE. The Sahara had once been green, lush with rivers, forests, and seasonal rains. But no one had imagined that such an environment had hosted not nomadic herders, but engineers, astronomers, architects. The city bore signs of scientific knowledge, passive cooling systems, modular expansion, water management using underground cisterns, and aqueducts. The evidence didn't stop there. In and around the ruins, the team found advanced metallurgy, tools and ornamentation cast with alloys requiring precise temperature control. They found agricultural remains, terrace farming, irrigation channels, and silos that once held grain. This was not survival. This was civilization. But when the team attempted to publish their findings, pressure came from unexpected corners. Egyptian antiquities officials objected. The idea that an advanced African civilization predated dynastic Egypt and operated entirely outside the Nile Valley was inconvenient. French authorities, wary of post-colonial narratives and political implications, classified the findings. The site was designated protected. Access was restricted. Lotta's research was shelved. Independent archaeologists trying to verify the findings were denied permits. Universities pulled support. The cities disappeared once more beneath the sands, this time not through wind, but through will. And yet the evidence lingers. Satellite imagery, now publicly available, shows faint outlines beneath the dunes, geometric grids, circles, linear paths. Patterns too precise to be natural. They echo Lotta's notes, now archived and largely forgotten. And oral histories from local tribes tell of ancient cities swallowed by the sands, of knowledge lost with the rains. Why do such discoveries threaten us? Perhaps because they suggest that history is not a ladder, but a spiral. Civilizations rising, falling, and rising again. That brilliance can bloom in places we have labeled barren. That time does not always move forward, and perhaps because they reveal that Africa's story, like humanity's, is not one of delay, but of depth. Somewhere beneath the Sahara, the wind continues to shift the dunes, uncovering and covering again the stones of a forgotten city. It waits, not for rescue, but for recognition. And the question remains, what other cities lie beneath our assumptions, patiently enduring the centuries, waiting to be seen? The Arctic wind cut through layers of clothing like time through memory, sharp, unrelenting, ancient. In 1973, a multinational team led by Dr. James Mitchell ventured into the frozen wilderness of the far north, searching not for people, but for climate patterns. They were drilling permafrost, mapping glacial cycles, and looking for signs of long-term environmental change. But what they found buried in the frozen earth would upend assumptions about when and how humans first reached the Americas. The team discovered artifacts in geological layers that, by every method of dating, were at least 45,000 years old, twice as old as the accepted timeline for human migration across the Bering Land Bridge. Stone tools, intricately shaped with precision flaking. Composite weapons crafted from bone, antler, and resin. Even fragments of textiles and leather, astonishingly preserved by the cold. More than tools, they found signs of culture, decorative etchings, ornaments fashioned from rare materials, evidence of group hunting strategies sophisticated enough to take down mammoths and cave bears. These were not primitive survivors. These were people who had mastered their environment. Most astonishingly, buried beneath the frost were components of boats, fragments of curved hulls, waterproofed seams, and materials consistent with Arctic maritime construction. It suggested these early inhabitants had not merely walked into the Americas, they had sailed. Navigation, engineering, cold weather survival. These were skills not expected from Ice Age humans. And yet, there they were. The implications were seismic. If humans had reached the Arctic 45,000 years ago, survived, built tools, organized hunts, crafted boats, then the story of human migration was far older and far more complex than previously imagined. The Bering Land Bridge was not the sole pathway. There were likely others, along coastlines now submerged, through networks now lost. But the discovery did not rewrite history. Instead, it was quietly shelved. Mitchell's team was instructed to cease excavation. Funding evaporated. The artifacts were removed to secure facilities, inaccessible to independent researchers. Officially, the discovery was attributed to contamination, misdating, or unresolved stratigraphic anomalies. Subsequent Arctic research was rerouted. Areas where the finds had occurred were declared ecologically sensitive and placed off-limits to further investigation. Why? Because this wasn't just about when humans arrived, it was about what they were capable of. To accept the artifacts meant rewriting assumptions about intelligence, innovation, and mobility in ancient humans. It meant acknowledging a level of organization and adaptability that didn't fit within the neatly tiered progression from primitive to civilized. We cling to the idea that the past is a straight road, that complexity is modern and simplicity is ancient, that knowledge grows in one direction. But the Arctic offers a different metaphor. Not a road, but a glacier, slow, immense, burying and revealing in cycles. What if human history is not a march, but a memory? Not ascending steps, but shifting ice, layers of genius and forgetting, warmth and retreat? In the silence of the north, where winds whisper through empty tundra, the traces of a forgotten people remain, not vanished, but frozen, waiting for the day we are ready to listen, and perhaps to remember what we once knew. Beneath the oldest streets of London, older paths lie buried, roads carved before history could name them. In 1987, as construction crews prepared to extend the Jubilee Underground Line, engineers drilled deep into the city's ancient foundations. They expected Roman ruins, perhaps a few medieval remnants. What they uncovered instead threatened to upend everything believed about London's earliest beginnings. Dr. Margaret Foster, head of the archaeological team assigned to monitor the dig, was the first to realize the significance. What emerged from the soil were not Roman structures at all, but tunnels and chambers that predated Roman London by thousands of years. Sophisticated, deliberate, and deeply engineered. The tunnels were perfectly circular in cross-section, with smooth stone surfaces and curved ceilings. architecture requiring advanced knowledge of structural integrity and geology. More than that, they were ventilated. Air moved through the passages with a rhythm and consistency that suggested intentional design. The layout formed an interconnected web, linking key points of elevation and proximity to the Thames, clearly designed for urban use. Further exploration revealed flood control mechanisms, reservoirs, and runoff channels engineered to manage seasonal water flow. The system rivaled the hydraulic infrastructure of much later civilizations. It wasn't just built, it was planned, adapted, and maintained. Dating of the surrounding strata placed the structures at least 4,000 years before the Roman conquest, an era when, according to mainstream history, the region was populated by scattered tribal societies with no cities and no written records. Even more puzzling were the tool marks, stone cuts so fine they suggested precision instruments. Metallurgical residue pointed to advanced alloy work, tools strong enough to shape stone with modern accuracy. It was, Foster noted in her journal, like finding a jet engine in an Iron Age village. But when she tried to publish her preliminary report, doors began to close. Heritage authorities expressed concern about public misinterpretation. Funding for further excavation was withdrawn. The construction route was quietly altered to bypass the most significant chambers. Access to the Discovery Zone was sealed under the pretext of preserving cultural heritage. The narrative remained untouched. Roman London as the city's birth, tribal Britain before that, nothing in between. Why the silence? Perhaps because these tunnels suggested that Britain had hosted a complex civilization long before Rome's arrival, that the so-called barbarians of the Isles might have been engineers, astronomers, builders. That civilization here had deeper roots, roots that complicate the imperial tale. London is a palimpsest, one city written over another. But we have grown comfortable reading only the topmost layer. Beneath the underground runs a deeper underground. Not metaphor, but stone and air, engineered space still breathing in silence. What if civilization rises not in a single cradle, but in many, sometimes in plain sight, then buried, forgotten, rediscovered, and dismissed? And what if history's greatest error is not what it remembers, but what it chooses not to see? Somewhere beneath the clamor of modern London, ancient corridors wait in darkness. Not ruins, but architecture. Not myth, but memory. And in that silence lies a question. How old is the idea of a city? And who were its first dreamers, carving tunnels in the earth while the world above slept in ignorance of its own beginning? From above, the Amazon appears infinite, an emerald expanse, tangled and untouched. But from space, the forest begins to speak. In 1999, a Brazilian-led team of researchers set out to study deforestation using satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar. What began as an environmental survey soon became something else entirely. Beneath the dense canopy, the data revealed lines, angles, and curves, geometries too deliberate to be natural. Dr. Anna Clark, a specialist in landscape analysis, led the discovery. The satellite images showed massive earthworks, circles, squares, and complex road networks stretching for miles. Further investigation revealed entire cities, urban complexes with plazas, causeways, irrigation canals, and residential zones. These were not camps or scattered villages. They were the skeletons of sophisticated civilizations. And they were everywhere. Radar scans identified dozens, then hundreds, of these settlements across the Amazon basin. Some were as large as modern cities, linked by straight roads that cut through forest and terrain with mathematical precision. These roads connected ceremonial centers, agricultural zones, and what appeared to be administrative complexes. Even more astonishing was the evidence of sustainable design. The ancient Amazonians had engineered their environment, not against it, but with it. Raised fields prevented flooding. Forest gardens mimicked natural ecosystems but produced food year-round. Canals, reservoirs, and fish farms supported large populations without exhausting the land. This was not a wilderness occupied by scattered tribes. It was a managed ecosystem, carefully cultivated, intelligently designed, and astonishingly resilient. Radiocarbon dating placed the peak of this civilization over 1,000 years before European contact. Population estimates based on the scale of infrastructure suggested millions once lived here, and yet the forest had reclaimed it all so completely that most archaeologists had assumed the region had never supported advanced society. The implications were enormous. They suggested that human civilization in the Americas was not limited to the Andes and Mesoamerica, but thrived in the rainforest as well. That the myth of the untouched Amazon was just that, a myth, and that indigenous knowledge of sustainable living far exceeded modern expectations. But instead of rewriting history, the findings were buried. Environmental organizations, fearing that proof of historical habitation might undermine conservation efforts, lobbied to restrict research. The Brazilian government classified the satellite data. Archaeological permits were quietly denied. Some researchers were advised not to speak publicly about their conclusions. The narrative held, the Amazon is pristine. The people who live there were always few, nomadic, primitive. The idea of complex cities in the jungle was dismissed as fantasy. But the forest remembers. Even today, when the sun strikes at the right angle, the outlines of these ancient earthworks emerge from beneath the trees. Geometric scars in the landscape, evidence not of destruction, but of design, of knowledge, of memory. What if the forest was not a frontier, but a cradle? What if the greatest ecological wisdom came not from imagining a world without people, but from remembering a time when people lived as part of the world? Beneath the canopy, buried in root and silence, an ancient city waits, not just for excavation, but for vindication, and perhaps for the return of its rightful place in the story of who we are. The sea is not always merciful with its memories, but sometimes it forgets to bury them deep enough. In the 1980s, during offshore drilling operations in the North Sea, something unexpected began surfacing in the core samples. Engineers extracting sediment for oil exploration found more than silt and stone. They found remnants of human presence, worked flints, carved bone, fragments of wood shaped by tools, and even metal objects that should not have existed at those depths. Dr. Robert Hansen, a geologist consulting for the operation, recognized the significance immediately. The layers from which these artifacts came had been underwater for at least 10,000 years, since the end of the last ice age, when rising seas had drowned vast stretches of land now lying beneath the North Sea. This was not accidental loss. These were the remains of settlements, foundations of buildings, artificial harbors, breakwaters engineered to tame the tide. The scale suggested more than scattered villages. It hinted at organized societies, civilizations, existing on a landmass long forgotten. Doggerland. Geological analysis showed that these people had mastered construction, using interlocking stone foundations and hydraulic principles previously unthinkable for Ice Age populations. Metallurgical residue on recovered objects indicated alloy production, evidence of smelting and metalworking traditions unknown to the official timeline of European prehistory. And yet, the story never reached the public. Oil companies, wary of delays and regulations, refrained from reporting most of the finds. Heritage laws, once triggered, could halt drilling. Better, it seemed, to file the evidence away. When Hansen attempted to publish, archaeological authorities denied access to key data, and core locations were quietly sealed under national security and environmental protections. Subsequent marine archaeology proposals targeting the same coordinates were rejected as logistically impractical or scientifically unsound. Research expeditions were rerouted. Public maritime maps labeled the areas as unremarkable geological formations. But beneath the sea, the cities wait. The implications stretch far beyond Europe. If advanced societies existed in Doggerland, what else was lost beneath the rising seas? What if entire chapters of human development now lie drowned beyond the reach of ordinary excavation, but not beyond the reach of truth? What if our ancestors understood the ocean, not as a boundary, but as a force to live with? What if they built harbors and walls and cities, and then watched the water take them all? And more hauntingly, what if we are not the first to face a rising tide? The North Sea whispers when the wind dies down. It tells of a land that was once alive with voices, footsteps, laughter. A land that did not disappear because it failed, but because the world around it changed. And as we look outward, imagining progress in the stars and machines we build, perhaps we owe a moment to look down, into the depths where the past still waits, where forgotten cities dream beneath the waves, and ask only this: will we remember them, or will we become them? Australia is ancient. Its rocks, its creatures, its dreaming. But its human story, we were told, began late. From 1985 to 1990, Dr. Rhys Jones and his team set out to challenge that timeline using a cutting-edge dating method, thermoluminescence. Unlike carbon dating, which becomes unreliable beyond 50,000 years, thermoluminescence could reach further into the past, measuring the last time artifacts had been exposed to sunlight or heat. Jones's team examined Aboriginal tools, hearths, and settlement layers across several Australian archaeological sites. What they found was staggering. The dates came back at 60,000 to 80,000 years. Stone tools, shaped with unmistakable precision, grinding stones, pigments, and hearths. The remains of dwellings and pathways between seasonal camps. In some areas, carvings adorned cave walls, symbols of a visual language that may have been the world's oldest. This was not a world of wandering hunter-gatherers. It was a landscape of management, memory, and meaning. Aboriginal peoples had developed complex technologies, navigational systems, and environmental strategies thousands of years before similar advancements appeared elsewhere. They cultivated land using fire-stick farming to shape ecosystems. They traded goods, stones, ochres, shell jewelry, across vast distances. And they passed down knowledge through oral histories so precise they mapped geography and seasonal change with a kind of living cartography. The implications went beyond age. If Aboriginal civilization stretched back 80,000 years, it meant they had not only survived environmental extremes, but had adapted with intelligence, continuity, and culture unmatched in duration by any other society on Earth. But when Jones attempted to publish the extended timelines, the backlash was immediate. Anthropological institutions warned that his findings contradicted established migration theories. University departments distanced themselves. The Australian government, facing delicate political questions around land rights and historical recognition, restricted excavation permits and sealed sites deemed culturally sensitive. Thermoluminescence data was called into question. Journals hesitated, and the wider implications that Australia was not an anthropological footnote but a cornerstone were quietly downplayed. What was lost in that silence was more than chronology. It was the recognition that culture is not a product of cities or monuments, but of memory, relationship, and resilience. That technology can look different, less like metal and machines, more like fire, stars, and song. That science and spirituality in the oldest cultures were never separate to begin with. Aboriginal knowledge systems encoded astronomy, medicine, ecology, and ethics long before such terms existed. They navigated landscapes with stories. They survived, not in spite of nature, but through intimate understanding of it. To see this past clearly requires humility. It asks us to release the assumption that progress only moves in one direction, or that the ancient must be simple. The red earth still holds the footprints of those who walked here before any other continent knew a name. Their descendants remember. In songlines and carvings, in language and ceremony, in the quiet assertion that they have always been here. And perhaps the question is not whether the timeline is wrong, but whether we are finally ready to listen to a history that never needed to be rewritten, only respected. What if the oldest science is sung? And what if the future of our understanding depends not on discovery, but on honoring what has already been known for 80,000 years? Ice and stone, silence and time. Antarctica conceals many secrets, but perhaps none so quietly revolutionary as what was found in 1980, the impossible remains of a warm world beneath the frozen one. As part of a global climate reconstruction initiative, the International Antarctic Research Expedition launched an ambitious drilling program to study ancient ice layers. Led by Soviet climatologist Dr. Elena Petrov, the team extracted ice cores reaching back hundreds of thousands of years, each layer preserving a trace of Earth's past atmosphere. But it wasn't just gas and dust trapped in the ice. One day, at a depth corresponding to a supposed deep glacial period, they pulled up something no one had expected: organic material. Intact, vivid, and unmistakably tropical. Palm fronds, ferns, fragments of flowering plants, their cells still visible under a microscope. Alongside them, pollen, insect remains, and even soil microorganisms. Evidence of an ecosystem that once thrived in warmth and light. It was not contamination. The layers were undisturbed, multiple dating methods aligned. Antarctica, it seemed, had once worn a crown of green. Further analysis painted an even stranger picture. This warmth hadn't occurred tens of millions of years ago, as previously thought, but a mere 400,000 years in the past, a blink in geological time. The data suggested Antarctica had swung rapidly between climates, moving from ice to temperate forest in spans far shorter than climate models allowed. And then came the pressure. Petrov's findings were celebrated briefly within closed scientific circles. But when she prepared to publish them publicly, she was told to stop. The Soviet Academy of Sciences classified the results. International collaborators, including NASA, quietly removed references to the tropical fossils from their reports. Officially, the cores were archived for environmental reasons. Unofficially, the implications were too vast. If Antarctica could support rainforests so recently, then our understanding of Earth's climatic stability was flawed. Our assumptions about glacial cycles, sea levels, even the mechanics of climate change would need revision. And with them, our predictions for the future. In the years that followed, the drilling site was declared ecologically sensitive. Access was denied. Later expeditions were steered away. And Petrov, once a rising figure in climate science, faded into institutional quiet. But the ice remembers. Within its compressed layers are still the imprints of leaves, the grains of pollen, the residue of warmth and water. Antarctica holds the memory of a world where the impossible was once simply true. What does it mean if the poles have not always been cold? If the maps we trust are only a snapshot in a long, restless film? Perhaps it means Earth is not the stable stage we imagine, but a shifting actor in its own drama, turning, tilting, changing its script without warning. And perhaps it means our story, too, is not as fixed as we believe. In the deep silence of Antarctica, there are forests that no longer rustle, rains that no longer fall, and flowers that bloomed beneath skies we can no longer recall. But their roots remain, frozen not in myth, but in fact, waiting, still, to thaw into truth. Time collapses in footprints. In 1938, Roland Byrd stepped into the bed of the Paluxy River in Texas and found what should have been impossible: the tracks of humans and dinosaurs side by side. Now, decades later, a similar collapse of time emerges, not in stone, but beneath it. The artifacts were unlike anything expected. D. In the end, it isn't the artifacts or the ruins or the fossils that haunt us most. It's the silence that follows them. 10 expeditions, 10 anomalies, 10 moments when something ancient surfaced, fleeting and fragile, only to be covered again, not by time, but by choice. We have traveled across deserts and oceans, into frozen wastelands, and beneath the canopies of rainforests. We have listened to whispers from ice cores, satellite maps, sonar scans, and forgotten stones. And at every turn, a question lingers. What if our story is far older, deeper, and more complex than we've allowed ourselves to imagine? The evidence doesn't claim perfection. It does not demand belief. It asks only for curiosity. And yet, institutions built on certainty often treat curiosity as a threat. Funding disappears. Data vanishes. Discoveries are framed as errors or quietly set aside, not because they are false, but because they do not fit. But history is not a jigsaw puzzle with only one correct image. It is a vast, unfinished tapestry. We have stitched together what we can, but many threads are still missing. Some were lost. Others were cut deliberately. What we have explored is not a conspiracy. It is a pattern of discomfort, of resistance, of a civilization hesitant to confront its own forgotten past. We are not censored by malice, but by momentum, the inertia of ideas too entrenched to challenge without risk. Still, the past endures. In riverbeds and sea floors, in the pollen sealed beneath glacial ice, in the geometry of cities swallowed by sand, the earth keeps its memories even when we do not. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of all, that civilizations rise and fall, not just once, but in cycles. That brilliance is not the property of the present. That knowledge can be lost, buried, and rediscovered, only to be lost again. But each time we recover a piece, we are offered a choice: to dismiss it or to listen, to defend what we know, or to wonder at what we might have forgotten. This series is not a call to discard science, but to deepen it, not to chase fantasy, but to widen the field of possibility, to ask not just what is true, but why we believe what we do, and who we become when we dare to let the story grow more strange, more beautiful, and more human. Because in the end, history is not only about the past, it is about identity, about who we think we are. And when that image is challenged, we do not lose our foundation, we find it. So let us walk with open eyes, let us read the silences, let us carry the questions forward. And let us remember, the greatest discoveries are not the ones that confirm what we already know. They are the ones that teach us how much more there is to learn.